The gods demanded pure blood, and in return they gave only poison. You wake to the sound of weeping echoing through marble corridors, each sob a fracture in the silence heavy as the ancient stones. But the tears are not for the dead Pharaoh lying encased in his golden sarcophagus under the glare of flickering oil lamps. They fall for the living king, who cannot stand without trembling, whose jaw has grown so twisted that priests must slip food between his lips like a helpless child whose body convulses in fits, that royal physicians whisper might be divine possession. The year is 1323 BC, and you are standing in the shadowed halls of Thebes, watching 18-year-old Tutankhamun, the so-called boy king, whose name would echo through centuries as one of history's most tragic figures, struggle to lift the sacred crook and flail that symbolize the power of Egypt. Beside him stands his sister wife, Ankhesenamun, her own skull, elongated teeth, jutting forward eyes deep-set and haunted, both of them bearing the visible marks of royal incest, the silent curse hidden behind the splendor of crowns and gilded thrones. The air itself seems to pulse with frankincense, and fear a mixture as intoxicating as it is suffocating, while court officials avert their gaze and exchange glances that beg the gods to look elsewhere. Everyone knows what none dare whisper aloud, that the so-called divine blood of the pharaohs has curdled into a toxin pulsing through arteries and veins, breeding not immortals, but a dynasty of fragile, suffering beings. These hidden truths lie beneath the glitter of Egypt's temples and pyramids, secrets of genetic disaster buried with the kings, waiting for archaeologists and modern DNA analysis to unearth them thousands of years later. This is the untold story of royal incest, the true hidden curse of ancient Egypt, a narrative woven with tragedy, genetic mysteries, and the fatal cost of keeping bloodlines pure at any price. If you're fascinated by ancient Egypt, secrets, hidden history, and shocking truths that reshape everything you thought you knew, then you're in the right place. Hit that like button, subscribe for more mysteries of royal bloodlines and ancient DNA secrets, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from, because together we're about to descend into the shadows behind Egypt's golden age, a place where divine blood became the deadliest poison of all. The ancient Egyptians did not practice royal incest out of mere lust or ignorance, nor was it the reckless decadence of kings intoxicated by absolute power, but rather it was born from a theology so intricately woven into the fabric of their civilization that to sever it would have been to unmake the world itself. For they believed their pharaohs were not merely men, but living gods whose veins pulsed with the sacred essence of the divine. And this belief in the sanctity of divine kingship lay at the very heart of Egypt's identity, forging a culture where the boundaries between mortal flesh and celestial power blurred until they became one and the same. And this is why in the grand halls of Thebes and Memphis, where walls shimmered with reliefs of gods and men entwined in a cosmic dance, royal incest was not a scandal, but a cosmic necessity, a ritual reenactment of the very act of creation itself, for in the oldest myths of Heliopolis, the god Atum brought forth the world by an act of self-generation, producing the twin deities Shu and Tefnut, who in turn united to birth Geb the earth and Nut the sky, whose children Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys married one another, binding the cycles of life and death, order and chaos in an endless divine circle. And thus it became sacred law that the pharaoh, as the earthly incarnation of Horus, must mirror the gods, marrying his sister or half-sister to keep pure the blood that tethered Egypt's fate to the heavens, because to marry outside the royal family was to risk diluting the god blood, severing the divine thread that ensured the Nile would rise each year, that the sun would blaze across the sky, and that Ma'at, the cosmic balance, would endure. And so the priests, guardians of divine mysteries, whispered warnings that if a pharaoh defied this sacred union, chaos would pour forth like sand through a broken jar, toppling temples, withering crops, and unleashing famine upon the land, a belief so powerful that when Amenhotep I once dared contemplate marriage to a foreign Mitanni princess in 1400 BC, the high priests of Thebes threatened to brand him unfit to rule, for they knew or believed with every fiber of their souls that Egypt's might flowed from an unbroken river of sacred blood, and even the grandest pyramids towering against the desert sky were mere stone without the living essence of divine kingship pulsing through the royal veins. And it was this theology that gave birth to a royal lineage among the 18th dynasty, where brother wed, sister and fathers took daughters as wives, forging alliances as much in blood as in spirit, turning the palace into both temple and prison, where love became a political weapon, and the cries of infants born too frail to survive echoed through the silent corridors of golden halls for the price of preserving. The godblood was measured not only in power, but in the twisted spines, cleft palates and clubbed feet of children born into both royalty and suffering. And though modern DNA analysis now reveals the monstrous cost of this policy, these hidden truths of ancient Egypt's secrets that lurk behind gilded sarcophagi and statues of serene-faced pharaohs. The ancient Egyptians could not have known the science of genes, yet they saw with their own eyes the deformities passed from father to son, from queen to daughter, and still they persisted, because in their world, the physical trials of the pharaoh were not proof of genetic collapse, but of divine testing of gods, forging mortal flesh in the crucible of suffering, and in this cruel paradox, the frailer the king, the more convinced the priests became that he was touched by heaven itself. For weakness was a sign of chosen souls bearing burdens no ordinary mortal could carry. And so the royal physicians, men who walked the thin line between science and sorcery, developed intricate treatments recorded on papyrus scrolls, documenting everything from surgical corrections for cleft palates to elaborate herbal mixtures to calm seizures and violent tremors. A hidden history of ancient medicine that would later astonish the world when rediscovered in dusty tombs and fragments of papyri, revealing that the ancients were not blind to patterns of inherited suffering, even if they lacked the words we now use: chromosomes, mutations, DNA genetic disorders. And yet, despite the creeping awareness of a curse flowing through the royal bloodlines, the dynasty pressed on because the alternative opening, the sacred royal marriage to outsiders, was unthinkable. A cosmic blasphemy that could shatter the very architecture of Egypt's power. And in the shadows of the temples, where gods loomed over mortals in painted reliefs of brilliant lapis, and gold courtiers and priests kept silent about the price they were paying. For to question the divine nature of the king was to risk not only one's life, but the stability of the world itself. And so even as artists struggled to capture the increasingly distorted forms of their pharaohs, stretching limbs, swelling bellies, elongating skulls in a new artistic style that broke with millennia of perfect proportion, the kingdom maintained the fiction of divine perfection, a fiction upheld in art, architecture and ceremony, because the people could never be allowed to see their god-kings as fragile men crippled by invisible curses. And this is why the doctrine of divine incest was more than politics or family tradition. It was the core of Egypt's cosmic order, a secret pact between throne and temple that kept the rivers flowing and the sun rising. And this is the chilling truth behind the mysteries of royal bloodlines and ancient Egypt's secrets that modern audiences find so irresistible, for it is both magnificent and monstrous. A civilization willing to sacrifice its own children on the altar of divine continuity. And as the centuries rolled forward, these beliefs would harden into chains that bound future kings like Amenhotep III, who married his sister Sitamun, producing a son whose body bore the marks of a crumbling genome, and kings like Akhenaten, whose own form grew so alien that artists had to invent an entirely new visual language to depict him with narrow faces, feminine hips and elongated heads that seem to belong more to spirits than men. And it is here at the crossroads of faith and genetics that we find the seeds of Egypt's greatest tragedy, for the very theology meant to preserve divine kingship instead became the poison that would rot the royal line from within. And as we move deeper into this hidden history of the pharaohs, we must remember that behind every golden mask lies flesh twisted by forces both divine and cruel. And this is the world into which Tutankhamun was born, a world where the cries of a child king struggling to walk were drowned beneath hymns to immortal gods. And it is in the flickering shadows of those hymns that our story now turns. For the next chapter in this tragic saga leads us into the tormented reign of the boy king himself, whose life would become the ultimate testament to the cost of keeping the royal blood pure at any price. They called him the Boy King, but behind the golden mask that would one day mesmerize the modern world, Tutankhamun was a prisoner of his own blood, a fragile soul caught in the merciless machinery of a dynasty determined to preserve divine purity at any cost for when he ascended the throne. At merely 9 years old, Egypt rejoiced, believing that Horus himself had returned to sit upon the throne of the living. But beneath the jubilant hymns and the incense curling through temple colonnades lay a truth as dark as the shadows flickering along the painted walls, for Tutankhamun, whose name means the living image of Amun, was born from the union of two full siblings, a pairing meant to protect the god blood, but which instead had become a silent curse flowing through every cell of his body and modern DNA analysis. Those chilling tools of our own age that unearth secrets no pyramid can contain has revealed a devastating cocktail of inherited afflictions. For Tutankhamun suffered from a cleft palate that made his speech labored a clubfoot that dragged behind him with each painful step, feminine hips that betrayed hormonal imbalance, and a curved spine that made standing upright an exercise in both physical agony and royal theatre. And the evidence of his suffering lies not only in the fragile bones discovered by Howard Carter in 1922, but in the poignant treasure trove of over 100 walking sticks buried with him, ranging from simple wooden canes to ornately carved staffs plated in gold. Each one a silent testament to a pharaoh who could barely walk, but was forced to rule as a god. And in the echoing halls of his court, every motion of the young king was a ritual. Each appearance a delicate performance meant to conceal the truth that Egypt's divine bloodline was rotting from within, and while courtiers prostrated themselves and chanted praises to the living god behind closed doors, royal physicians hovered like silent priests around the pharaoh's trembling frame, administering complex treatments that seem astonishingly sophisticated, even by modern standards, for the ancient Egyptians were masters of medicine. Their knowledge etched into papyrus scrolls like the Edwin Smith papyrus, which detailed surgical procedures and neurological disorders that eerily matched the symptoms tormenting Tutankhamun. And though they could not name chromosomes or genetic mutations, these physicians recognized patterns, tracing the twisted branches of royal genealogy and recording observations of club feet, misshapen skulls and minds seized by divine visions. And one papyrus from the reign of Amenhotep III even speaks of the curse of god blood, acknowledging that royal children were often born with the same physical deformities, a hidden history buried for millennia beneath the sands until modern science resurrected their secrets. And in this silent war against inherited disease, Egypt's healers developed tools and techniques centuries ahead of their time, performing surgeries to correct cleft palates and creating herbal concoctions meant to ease seizures, though ultimately even the best efforts of the most skilled physicians could not conquer the relentless force of genetic fate, and thus Tutankhamun's reign became a delicate charade, a royal pageant choreographed to maintain the illusion of divine perfection, even as his body betrayed him at every turn. And modern forensic studies have added fresh layers of horror and intrigue to his story. For CT scans of his mummified remains reveal not only evidence of scoliosis and a skull marred by possible hydrocephalus, a buildup of fluid that can cause excruciating headaches, but also a blow to the back of the head suggesting violence. A detail that fuels endless speculation among historians and conspiracy seekers alike, and his ribs lie shattered in a pattern consistent with either a fall from a great height, perhaps from a royal chariot racing across Egypt's dusty roads, or with the brutal force of an assassin's blow. And as scientists probed deeper chemical analysis of his organs, revealed high levels of antimony, a substance used in ancient Egypt both as medicine and as a silent killer, raising the terrifying question, did Tutankhamun succumb to illness and congenital weakness, or was he murdered by courtiers who saw in his frail frame the end of Egypt's divine legacy, and whose ambition demanded the removal of a boy king too weak to rule for? In a palace where power was a currency traded in shadows, a ruler who could not stand might as well have been already dead, and though history cannot give a definitive verdict. The speed with which Tutankhamun was embalmed suggests that his death was sudden and unexpected, for the embalmers worked in frantic haste, leaving his chest cavity partially collapsed, and evidence that his body may even have been scorched as though by fire, before the oils and resins sealed his fate forever within layers of linen and gold, and this haste may not have been merely practical, but driven by fear. For perhaps the priests and healers worried that the same genetic curse that twisted the pharaoh's body in life might continue to manifest in death, deforming his divine image and threatening the cosmic order that Egypt so desperately clung to, and thus the iconic golden mask that gazes serenely upon us from behind museum glass is both a triumph of artistry and a monstrous deception. For beneath its perfect features lies a youth ravaged by disease, his every bone a map of suffering, his every sinew a reminder that the pursuit of pure royal blood had birthed not gods, but fragile beings whose thrones were built upon the quicksand of genetic decay. And it is this hidden truth, this haunting intersection of divinity and mortality, that fuels our endless fascination with Tutankhamun, transforming him from mere historical figure into an eternal mystery. For he stands as both a symbol of ancient Egypt's grandeur and its fatal flaw, and in the modern age, the viral allure of Tutankhamun's secrets and ancient Egypt DNA drives millions to seek the truth behind his golden mask. For his story resonates with something deeper than mere curiosity. It speaks to the human terror of what lies hidden within our own blood. And as we peel back the gilded wrappings of history, we are forced to confront a chilling question. How many kings and queens throughout time have ruled not because they were chosen by gods, but because they were the tragic victims of dynasties obsessed with purity at any price? And as we leave the flickering shadows of Tutankhamun's court, our journey through this hidden history is far from over. For beyond the sands of ancient Egypt rises another dynasty who would embrace royal incest even more fervently than the pharaohs, crafting marriages so entangled that their family tree would become a spiraling prison of genetic doom. And it is to these rulers, the Ptolemies of Egypt, whose secrets eclipse even those of the boy king, that our story now turns. Long after the sands had swallowed the tombs of the pharaohs, another dynasty would rise from the ashes of conquest, determined to rule Egypt with a grip even tighter than the golden fists of the god kings who came before. For when Alexander the Great carved his empire into fragments upon his death, one of his most trusted generals, Ptolemy, Soter, seized Egypt like a jewel wrested from the gods themselves, and though he began his reign as a Macedonian conqueror, he swiftly discovered that to rule this ancient land was not merely a matter of armies and gold, but of divine legitimacy. And so the Ptolemies, a dynasty of Greek blood, wrapped themselves in the mantle of pharaonic tradition, adopting not only the titles and regalia of Egypt's sacred kings, but the most taboo of their customs, royal incest. For they understood with ruthless clarity that power in Egypt was not just political, it was mystical, bound to the sacred fiction that only divine blood could command the floods of the Nile and keep Mayat, the cosmic order, intact. And thus the Ptolemaic dynasty plunged into a deliberate and systematic practice of intermarriage so severe that the royal family tree became less a branching network of kinship than a tightening spiral coiling ever inward, until by the time Cleopatra VII ascended the throne, her lineage contained only 6 distinct ancestors, where any normal genealogy would have boasted 32, a shocking statistic that remains one of the most haunting secrets of ancient Egypt hidden truths. And it was not merely devotion to Egyptian religious doctrine that drove them to this abyss, but also the cold calculus of politics. For the Ptolemies were foreigners ruling over a vast native population who might at any moment rise in revolt. And so they saw incest not as an abomination, but as a political firewall, locking power within the narrow confines of a single bloodline and preventing rival factions or foreign alliances from seizing the throne. And in this strategy, they were relentless. For Ptolemy II set the template by divorcing his first wife to marry his full sister Arsinoe II, an act both scandalous and triumphant, for their union was celebrated in ceremonies that blended Greek pomp with Egyptian ritual, transforming their incestuous bond into a symbol of divine kingship that merged the gods of Olympus with the deities of the Nile, and the precedent was set each generation sinking deeper into the genetic whirlpool, culminating in rulers like Ptolemy VII, who married first his sister Cleopatra II, then, after her death, married her daughter Cleopatra III, his own niece, and finally, in a macabre echo of familial looping, married Cleopatra IV, making him simultaneously uncle-stepfather and husband to the same woman. A twisted web of relations that reads today like the script of a forbidden tragedy, but which in the Ptolemaic court was a calculated ritual of power. And as the centuries passed, the physical and mental toll of this dynastic strategy grew impossible to ignore, for contemporary historians speak of kings whose bodies ballooned into grotesque masses like Ptolemy VIII, Phascon, whose very name, meaning potbelly, became a cruel nickname whispered in the marble corridors of Alexandria's palaces, and whose weight grew so immense that he could no longer walk unaided, requiring entire teams of servants to lift and transport him, while his throne was reinforced with beams of cedar to keep from collapsing under his bulk, a man described as sweating. Profusely gasping for breath and plagued by fits of violent rage, a monstrous figure who epitomized the hidden genetic disaster of the Ptolemaic dynasty secrets that modern viewers find so irresistibly shocking. And yet it was not merely physical deformities that haunted this royal house, but a creeping madness that twisted the minds of kings and queens alike. For Ptolemy IV, who ruled from 221 to 204. BC was notorious for his paranoia, murdering his own mother, brother, and uncle in a single brutal purge, convinced they plotted against him, then marrying his sister Arsinoe III and forcing her to participate in elaborate religious rituals that even contemporary observers labeled as divine madness. And in the shadows of these glittering palaces, the royal physicians waged an invisible war, developing treatments to manage the physical agony and psychological torment afflicting their rulers, crafting mechanical devices to aid deformed kings in walking, prescribing specialized diets for rulers whose bodies threatened to betray them under the weight of genetic fate, and concocting herbal mixtures to quell seizures and hallucinations that might otherwise burst forth in public ceremonies. Yet despite their skills, the dynasty's genetic bottleneck could not be reversed, and each successive ruler emerged frailer than the last, until the throne itself seemed less an object of glory than a gilded cage for a bloodline collapsing under the weight of its own ambition. And buried in the archives of Oxyrhynchus and Phaeum lie papyrus contracts that document this genetic obsession in chilling detail, specifying who might marry whom, how many children they should produce, and in what order, revealing a dynasty so consumed by its own blood that it reduced royal marriage to a matter of mathematical precision. And as the family's genetic pool shrank to a perilous trickle, physical consequences became impossible to disguise, with ancient writers describing rulers whose features grew increasingly alien, with elongated skulls, protruding eyes, and voices that trembled with a curiously high-pitched feminine timbre, while others, like Cleopatra VII herself, were rumored to possess a masculine voice and prominent teeth, physical traits that lurk behind the iconic limestone bust immortalized in museums today. For even the legendary queen who seduced the titans of Rome was not immune to the inherited scars of 11 generations of incest, and though her intelligence and political genius made her one of the most formidable women in history, the truth beneath the paint and propaganda may have been far less beautiful. And it is this duality, the collision of royal grandeur with genetic catastrophe, that makes the secrets of the Ptolemaic dynasty viral gold. For modern audiences craving hidden history and shocking truths, for we are drawn like moths to the blazing flame of this paradox that a family who ruled as living gods might have been undone not by enemies at their gates, but by the very blood that bound them together. And as we peer deeper into these ancient corridors of power, we see that the Ptolemies did not merely inherit Egypt's throne, they inherited its curse, and their desperate quest to preserve divine blood would ultimately forge a dynasty destined for extinction. And as the curtain falls on this chapter of entwined kings and queens of love and power, twisted into a deadly spiral, we must turn our gaze toward the consequences that rippled beyond the palace walls, For the genetic disaster of the Ptolemies did not remain confined within royal chambers, but spilled outward, reshaping the economy, the culture, and the very soul of Egypt itself, and it is into this world of hidden costs and unspoken truths that our story now ventures. In the glittering palaces of Alexandria, behind walls inlaid with gold leaf and echoing with hymns to gods both Greek and Egyptian, the Ptolemaic dynasty's obsession with keeping royal blood pure rippled far beyond the twisted spines and haunted eyes of kings and queens, for while royal incest may have been born of theology and political necessity, its consequences seeped into every artery of Egypt's society, poisoning the empire from within like a slow-moving venom, and the first price paid was economic, for the fragile bodies and volatile minds of inbred rulers demanded ceaseless medical intervention, drawing upon a treasury once overflowing with the riches of pharaonic conquests, and records uncovered from Oxyrhynchus reveal staggering expenditures allocated not to build monuments or expand borders, but to finance private physicians, special diets, mechanical devices to help rulers walk or sit upright during ceremonies, and entire battalions of servants required to dress feed, and even carry kings who could no longer support their own weight. And it is written that Ptolemy VIII Physcon consumed nearly 10% of Egypt's annual revenue merely to maintain his grotesque bulk and to pay for physicians to treat his constant labored breathing and unstoppable perspiration, a viral-worthy hidden truth that modern audiences find both horrifying and fascinating. For how can a god-king rule when he cannot rise from his own throne without help? And the economic strain did not stop there, for as royal expenses ballooned, taxes grew ever more crushing, squeezing peasants and urban merchants alike, until resentment simmered dangerously close to revolt and papyri, from the Fayum record increasing uprisings by farmers unable to pay imperial levies, a sign that beneath the marble floors of the royal court, Egypt's social fabric was beginning to tear. And yet the damage was not merely financial, but cultural and artistic, for the relentless parade of genetic deformities among the ruling family forced artists to abandon centuries of sacred conventions, for how could one carve a king into the timeless perfection of stone when his limbs were twisted, his belly distended, and his face marred by features that belonged more to nightmare than divinity? And thus, under Akhenaten and the later Ptolemies, a radical new artistic style was born, one that stretched bodies into unnatural elongation, bellies swollen like pregnancy eyes narrowed to slits. A desperate attempt to reconcile physical reality with the propaganda of divine kingship. And this visual shift, so visible in temple reliefs and royal statues, became both a code and a confession, a hidden history written not in hieroglyphs but in proportions and silhouettes and even architecture, bent under the weight of royal frailty. For corridors in palaces and tombs where widened ramps replaced stairs, and hidden mechanical contraptions were installed to help physically compromised monarchs appear in public with at least a facade of majesty. For nothing was more dangerous to the state than the truth of a king unable to stand before his people, and these adaptations, visible only to those who dared look behind the gilt screens of ceremony, became secret monuments to a royal house battling the invisible monster of its own blood. And yet the greatest casualty of all was spiritual. For Egypt was a civilization built upon the idea that kings were gods on earth, avatars of Horus and Osiris, whose physical perfection mirrored the cosmic order. But how could a people keep faith in such divine kingship when their rulers staggered and wept and required iron braces just to keep their heads upright? And so the priesthood guardians of Egypt's sacred truths found themselves trapped in theological contortions. For to admit that royal incest had birthed monsters was to admit that the gods themselves had erred, and thus they spun new doctrines declaring that the pharaoh's physical suffering was proof of divine favor, that weakness was a test sent from the heavens to prove a king's sacred worth. But these desperate explanations grew increasingly hollow as the evidence of genetic disaster mounted, and while hymns still rang through temple halls, graffiti scratched into the walls of workmen's villages told a different story, depicting pharaohs with bloated bellies and feminine hips, accompanied by crude captions mocking their godhood. a hidden history that reveals a people beginning to doubt the sacred myths upon which their civilization stood, and as confidence in divine kingship waned, so too did Egypt's influence on the international stage, for foreign emissaries arriving at the Ptolemaic court were often shocked by the sight of rulers whose appearance betrayed profound inbreeding. And diplomatic letters from the Amarna archives record the barely concealed scorn of rival kings who described the Egyptian monarch as the god who speaks like a woman and walks like a child, a line that would have been unthinkable in earlier centuries when pharaohs commanded respect across empires, and this loss of respect rippled outward, weakening Egypt's military alliances, eroding its diplomatic leverage, and emboldening foreign powers eager to exploit a kingdom ruled by monarchs more fragile than divine. And the psychological toll within the royal court was equally devastating for courtiers and priests forced to maintain the illusion of divine perfection, lived in a constant state of fear, for to acknowledge the truth was to risk death, and memoirs from exiled Greek philosophers describe a surreal environment of whispered codes, rehearsed dialogues designed to cover royal disabilities, and a suffocating anxiety that even a single misplaced word could lead to execution. A chilling hidden history of mental siege that modern audiences find deeply compelling because it exposes how absolute power can rot not only flesh but sanity. And yet, amidst all this decay, the knowledge painstakingly developed to sustain these compromised royals spilled over into Egyptian society, at large, yielding unexpected benefits. For surgical techniques perfected on royal bodies were eventually applied to commoners, leading to medical advances that saved countless lives, and papyri, such as the Edwin Smith document, contained descriptions of procedures that would not be seen again in Europe for nearly 2,000 years. A legacy born from tragedy, but one which allowed Egypt to remain, even in decline, a beacon of ancient science. And it is this paradox, the coexistence of brilliance and catastrophe, that ensures Egypt's story never loses its viral magnetism. For we remain haunted by the idea that the very bloodline which crowned pharaohs as living gods was the same force that crippled them both physically and politically, setting in motion the kingdom's slow unraveling beneath the weight of genetic doom. And as we prepare to turn our gaze to the final queen of this blood-stained lineage, a woman whose beauty has become legend, yet whose own veins carried the same fatal inheritance, we must ask ourselves if Cleopatra VII was the dynasty's greatest triumph or its final tragic sacrifice, for in her life and death lies the culmination of everything Egypt had become, and it is toward her shadowy figure, poised between power and ruin, that our story now inexorably moves. She has been immortalized as the ultimate femme fatale, the enchantress who toppled empires and bent mighty men to her will. But behind the legends of silk-draped seduction and midnight whispers lies the hidden truth of Cleopatra VII, a queen born from 11 generations of royal incest, whose blood carried not merely the legacy of divine pharaohs, but the scars of a genetic curse centuries in the making. For Cleopatra was the living embodiment of both Egypt's boundless ambition and its fatal flaw, and though the world remembers her as a creature of dazzling beauty, her very existence was a triumph against overwhelming biological odds. For modern geneticists have calculated that where any ordinary person would possess 32 distinct ancestors within 5 generations, Cleopatra's royal bloodline had collapsed into a mere 6. A staggering figure that exposes the chilling spiral of the Ptolemaic dynasty's secrets. And though Roman poets and historians would paint her as a vision of irresistible allure, recent forensic analysis and historical accounts hint at a far different woman beneath the propaganda, a queen whose skull may have been slightly elongated, whose teeth protruded enough to suggest severe malocclusion, whose voice was said to resonate with a masculine timbre that startled Roman senators accustomed to the delicate tones of patrician wives. For Cleopatra's power lay not merely in her appearance, but in her mind, a sharp strategic brilliance honed in the crucible of one of history's most dangerous courts, and she spoke at least 9 languages, read philosophy, commanded armies, and negotiated with emperors, transforming her court into both a center of culture and a fortress of political intrigue, and yet even she could not escape the shadow of her own blood. for contemporary accounts suggest that beneath her flowing royal robes, Cleopatra bore subtle markers of the same genetic afflictions that had crippled her ancestors, a hidden history that lends an eerie weight to modern viral searches like Cleopatra DNA and Cleopatra Secrets. For the truth is far more complex than the legend, and her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, so often reduced to romantic melodrama in films and novels, were in fact ruthless political alliances forged in desperation, for Caesar needed Egypt's vast grain reserves, and Cleopatra required the protection of Rome's legions to secure her throne against rival siblings and factions who saw in her genetic vulnerabilities the perfect pretext to challenge her rule. And when she bore Caesar a son, Caesarion, she envisioned a new dynasty that might unite Rome and Egypt under one banner. But that hope was doomed from the start, for the boy, though described as intelligent, inherited his mother's genetic burdens. Growing into a youth whose physical frailty made him unfit to command the loyalty of Rome's hardened legions, and so too did her liaison with Mark Antony, a union forged not in the fires of love, but in the cold necessity of empire, for Antony, locked in a deadly contest with Octavian for control of Rome, needed Egyptian wealth to fund his armies, while Cleopatra, fully aware of her dynasty's precarious position, sought a Roman protector who might preserve her son's claim to the throne. Yet even as she maneuvered through the treacherous waters of Mediterranean politics, Cleopatra's kingdom was already rotting from within, for the genetic disaster of the Ptolemaic line had eroded not only the physical bodies of its monarchs, but the political infrastructure of Egypt itself, leaving a realm vulnerable to both rebellion and foreign conquest, and the same royal incest that had once secured Egypt's throne now threatened to destroy it entirely as foreign observers, including Roman ambassadors and soldiers, recoiled in thinly veiled disgust at a royal house whose members bore visible signs of inbreeding and whose whispered afflictions were becoming the hidden history that threatened to break the illusion of divine kingship once and for all. And even Cleopatra's legendary charisma could not entirely mask the suspicions that swirled around her health. For Roman propaganda began circulating rumors that she was more monster than monarch, a queen whose seductive powers were a cloak for monstrous deformities. And while much of this was political slander, it remains undeniable that Cleopatra carried the genetic legacy of 11 generations of incest, a fact that casts a shadow across every marble bust and painted fresco that celebrates her supposed perfection. And yet this same woman who bore the dynasty's genetic curse also possessed a force of will so powerful that it nearly rewrote the map of the ancient world. For Cleopatra's political genius delayed Egypt's collapse for decades, allowing her to hold together an empire teetering on the brink of annihilation. And though the love stories that swirl around her name still capture the viral imagination keywords like Cleopatra love story and hidden truths of Cleopatra, the real drama of her life lies in her fierce attempt to wield the last scraps of Egypt's sovereignty against the unstoppable tide of Rome, for in the final desperate days after the crushing defeat at the Battle of Actium, Cleopatra's advisors urged surrender, yet she chose to die rather than endure the humiliation of being paraded through the streets of Rome as a curiosity, a living trophy of Octavian's triumph. And so, with a venomous asp pressed to her skin, Cleopatra brought to an end not merely her own life, but the millennia-spanning experiment of royal incest that had shaped and ultimately doomed Egypt's royal house, and in her final act, she preserved. For a fleeting moment, the dignity of a throne her ancestors had twisted into a genetic labyrinth, and as the golden sun sank over Alexandria, leaving the library to crumble and the palaces to echo with silence, the dynasty's secrets lay buried beneath layers of propaganda and stone, waiting to be unearthed by future historians, archaeologists, and the viral curiosity of modern audiences. For Cleopatra stands as the perfect embodiment of Egypt's paradox, a queen revered as a goddess, yet bound by mortal flesh, riddled with inherited weakness. And as we prepare to peel back the final layer of this tragic saga, we must look beyond Cleopatra herself to understand the full consequences of royal incest. For her reign was not merely the end of a single life, but the funeral song of an entire world order. and it is toward the aftermath of her death, the Roman conquest, and the ultimate revelation of how the secrets of Egypt's royal bloodlines shaped history for centuries to come, that our journey now leads. When Cleopatra's pulse ceased on that silent August day in 30th BC, and the serpent's bite spilled the final drops of divine blood onto the marble floors of her palace, it was not merely the death of a queen that echoed through Egypt's halls, but the collapse of an entire cosmic order, for with her passing, the last fragile thread connecting Egypt's royal house to the ancient gods was severed, and into that void stepped Octavian, soon to become Augustus, whose legions marched into Alexandria not merely as conquerors of territory, but as heirs to secrets so devastating they might shake the confidence of any empire. And as Roman soldiers cracked open storerooms and rifled through the sealed vaults of the Ptolemies, they discovered not only gold papyrus scrolls of philosophy and the dust of forgotten scrolls from the Library of Alexandria, but a hidden archive chronicling 3 centuries of genetic catastrophe. And it is written that in vaults beneath the royal palaces lay records meticulously kept by generations of royal physicians, documenting birth defects, stillbirths, physical deformities and mental maladies that afflicted Egypt's kings and queens, a hidden history so grim that even hardened legionaries were said to avert their eyes. For these scrolls revealed the true price of royal incest, a toll paid in twisted spines, clubbed feet, bloated bodies, and minds driven to violent paranoia. And among these records were detailed descriptions of surgical procedures, herbal remedies, and mechanical devices crafted to sustain monarchs who could barely stand. And it was from these very documents that the Roman physician Galen, arriving in Alexandria a century later, would glean insights that would shape Western medicine for over 1,000 years, transforming hidden Egyptian secrets into the foundation of European anatomical knowledge. Yet the revelations did not end with medicine alone, for Octavian and his advisors understood with chilling clarity that the fall of Egypt's divine bloodline held political lessons too grave to ignore, and so they devised a new imperial system in Rome that combined bloodline legitimacy with adoption, creating a dynasty flexible enough to avoid the lethal genetic traps that had destroyed the Pharaohs and the Ptolemies. And it is one of history's cruel ironies that while Egypt's royal family had clung to the notion of divine blood until it rotted their kingdom from within, the Romans learned from their mistakes, building an empire that for centuries balanced heredity with merit. And yet even the mighty Romans were not wholly immune, for whispers of incest would rise again among the Julio-Claudian line, most infamously under Caligula, who declared himself a living god and allegedly lay with his own sister's behavior that eerily echoed the genetic hubris that had brought down the house of Cleopatra, a hidden history that fascinates modern audiences hungry for shocking truths about ancient dynasties. And so the shadow of Egypt's royal incest stretched far beyond its own tombs, shaping the political calculations of empires yet unborn. And as centuries rolled onward, the genetic disaster of Egypt became both cautionary tale and forbidden curiosity for medieval scholars. Renaissance anatomists and Enlightenment thinkers alike pored over fragments of Egyptian medical texts, marveling at the surgical skill, even as they recoiled at the genetic consequences described therein. And in the realm of art, the influence was equally profound, for the idealized images of pharaohs with perfect limbs and godlike faces, so often repeated in colossal statues and golden death masks, inspired artistic canons across Europe, embedding the lie of divine perfection deep into Western culture. A visual propaganda born not of beauty alone, but of a desperate attempt to conceal a dynasty's genetic decay, and thus the shimmering legacy of Egyptian art, admired for its symmetry and serenity, is forever intertwined with the tragic truth it was designed to hide. And even religion did not escape the fallout, for the collapse of Egypt's divine monarchy shattered millennia of theological certainty, leaving priests scrambling to explain why the gods would allow their chosen kings to become monsters of flesh. And though some claimed that physical suffering was a sign of divine favor, others whispered that the gods had withdrawn their blessing altogether. A spiritual crisis that left room for new faiths to flourish, including cults like Serapis and eventually Christianity itself, whose promise of salvation beyond mortal bloodlines appealed to a world weary of dynasties undone by their own veins, and so the echoes of royal incest reverberated from the banks of the Nile into the cathedrals of medieval Europe, into the lecture halls of Renaissance doctors, into the vaults of modern DNA labs seeking to unlock the genetic mysteries hidden in the mummies that lie still beneath painted sarcophagi, and in our own age as algorithms feed us viral videos and endless reels of shocking truths and hidden histories. The tragic saga of Egypt's royal bloodline has become digital legend, drawing millions to search terms like ancient DNA secrets, Cleopatra, real face Tutankhamun, genetic disorders and hidden truths of the pharaohs, for we remain mesmerized by the paradox that the same blood which crowned kings as gods was the very poison that destroyed them. And in this contradiction lies Egypt's ultimate lesson to history, that no matter how high a throne may rise, no matter how thick the walls of a pyramid, or how blinding the gold of a burial mask, the truth of blood cannot be denied, and as modern science pierces the wrappings of mummies and reveals the grim map of inherited suffering etched into ancient bones, we are forced to confront our own hubris. For the story of Egypt's royal incest is not merely a tale of forgotten pharaohs, but a timeless warning of the cost of believing that blood alone makes us divine. And as we close the marble doors on this epic chronicle, leaving the echoes of divine hymns and mortal cries to fade into silence, one truth stands immutable. The weeping that once rolled through the marble corridors of Thebes on the day Tutankhamun died was not merely for a fallen king, but for an entire bloodline that had spent 1,000 years becoming less than human in the desperate attempt to become gods. And though Egypt's pyramids still claw at the sky, glittering beneath the sun, they stand as monuments not merely to human greatness, but to the tragic price of genetic hubris. And so our journey through these ancient corridors of power ends where it began, in the shadows behind the gold, where secrets still whisper, and where the ghosts of kings remind us that in seeking divinity, they forgot how to remain human. And so we stand here at the edge of eternity, gazing back across the sands of Egypt, where gods once walked as men, and men dared to call themselves gods, only to discover that even the mightiest bloodline cannot escape the laws written deep within our flesh, for the Pharaohs and the Ptolemies chased immortality through bloodlines so pure they became poison, reminding us that true power lies not in who we are born to be, but in what we choose to become. And perhaps that is the hidden lesson, buried within golden masks and silent tombs, that divinity is not found in blood, but in wisdom, compassion, and the courage to see truth, even when it terrifies us. And if these ancient secrets stirred something within you, if the echoes of the past make you question the present, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below, because your voice helps keep history alive. And if you crave more mysteries, hidden truths, and the untold stories behind ancient empires, save this video to return whenever the pyramids call your name, and subscribe to join a community that believes history is more than dates and kings. It's the key to understanding ourselves, because in the end, though we may no longer build pyramids, we are still writing the story of what it means to be human, and that story is far from over.